If I show you this photo, most of you can identify a cute, fluffy bear flying through the clouds. And if I show you this image, some of you might see a human male face on the top right corner. So these photos show a visual phenomenon known as pareidolia, which is seeing patterns, seeing illusions that don't really exist, just like seeing faces in clouds. And some of these patterns or illusions that we can see are really interesting. For example, in this image, I can see Donald Trump, and who knows what you can see. So moving on to this photo, this is the logo for the Swiss chocolate Toblerone, where you have an icon of the Swiss Alps in the background. But if you zoom in, if you take a closer look, you will find a bear hidden in that logo. Now, I've been eating that chocolate for years, and I didn't even know there was a bear hidden in that logo. Moving on to this photo, known as the Mars face. It was taken by NASA, and it fueled alien theories everywhere into thinking there was life on Mars just because of that presumed human face. So these photos show our tendency, our proclivity, to making wrong visual conclusions, wrong judgments of our surroundings. And it led me to think about decision-making, how we make our decisions. Raise your hands if you think you are rational. Okay. No smart guys? Okay. So, I once thought that I made logical choices, that I made rational decisions, that I was rational, until I came across this question. If we make frequently wrong decisions with what we see, given that sight is something instinctive, something we use every single day of our lives, aren't we more likely to make wrong decisions with what we think, what we choose, what we plan, or what we believe? If we make wrong decisions with simple objects lying everywhere around us, aren't we more likely to make irrational decisions with complicated ideas in our lives? One of the irrational decisions we human beings can make is racism. Now, you might think, what does racism, discrimination, has to do with irrationality? But think of that Leonardo DiCaprio scene in the movie Django Unchained. In that scene, DiCaprio, casting as the character called Candy, who was a rough and cruel slave owner and white supremacist, he grabs the skull of a former black servant of his. He cracks that skull open, and he says, in the skull of the African here, the area associated with submissiveness, servility, is larger than any other human or subhuman species on planet Earth. Wow. What led such a nice guy like Candy here to believe in the superiority of the white race over the black race? What led Candy to have such despicable ideas about human beings? Why did Candy make that irrational decision? The behavior Candy showed here is actually a very famous kind of irrational decision-making we all can make, called confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is simply choosing the evidence that support your belief while ignoring any other evidence against it. It is seeing what you believe, seeing what you want to see. In the case of Candy here, Candy was raised up completely believing in the truthfulness of his actions. He showed a textbook example of confirmation bias to the extent that he believed the vague scientific evidence of white supremacy. Racism and discrimination are a byproduct of confirmation bias, of irrationality. Now imagine we just remove confirmation bias from the equation. Does that mean we just put an end to racism? Now, you guys might think that I'm not rational, I'm not racist, you're not racists. So how can your decisions be biased? How can they be irrational? But actually, human irrationality runs even deeper. Our environment, our surroundings, not just our beliefs, can all affect and influence our decisions more than you realize. Raise your hands if you think you are shopping addicts. You're addicted to shopping. Where are the rich people? Okay, so I don't want to discourage you shopping addicts or buying experts from going shopping, but it is likely that the choices you make, that the decisions you make are not logical, are not rational. So a very famous experiment showed how choices basically paralyzes consumers and causes them to start thinking irrationally. There was once a tasting booth in a store for selling jams, where you had booth A that had 6 choices, 6 different varieties of jam, and booth B with 24 choices, 24 different varieties of jam. The 6 choices of jam attracted 30% of tasters to buy, while the 24 choices attracted only 3%. So we tend to view choices as a test. And like a test or an exam can make you too nervous to think correctly, too many choices can do just the same. More choices, less logic. Because of the huge amount of choices and changes around us, while shopping, you don't actually think as much as you think you do. 40% of consumers change their minds at the point of purchase because of something new they see, learn, or do. So irrelevant factors like the comments of your friends, the music played in a restaurant, the design of a certain product can all affect and influence your decision more than the quality of the service you want. We also tend to pick choices relative to other choices. So how does that work? So this was an experiment made by Professor Dan Ariely, who is a professor of behavioral economy, which you don't need to know about. Anyway, Professor Dan here gave this magazine subscription to a bunch of MIT students. And he told them to pick either the web subscription for $59, the print subscription for $125, or both, also for $125. So naturally, most of these students picked the last 2-for-1 option. One might reason that the second option was useless because no one chose it. So then remade the experiment, but this time he removed the second unchosen option, and the results changed. The first option became the most popular, and the last option became the least popular. So Dan concluded that the mere presence of the second useless option made the other options seem fantastic. Who in their right mind would have a print subscription for $125 or a web subscription for $59 when they can own both just for $125? So when we have a group of choices, a really bad choice will make the other choices seem fantastic, even though it is irrelevant. You might not need to even buy a magazine. When we have a group of choices, we make relationships between choices that don't really exist, and then we make our decisions based on these relationships. If you can't see the irrationality of this, think about this sentence. 100% of people who eat bread will eventually die. Now, of course, if someone is unfortunate today who will eventually die, he will not die because of eating bread. So like the author of this sentence made the relationship between eating bread and dying, we make relationships that don't exist between choices and each other, leading us to make irrational decisions. So, as a shopper, as a consumer, your environment, your surroundings, your beliefs, or the other choices presented to you can all affect and influence your decision. And unfortunately, marketers, corporations, big companies know how to use our irrationality to affect our decisions, to make us buy things we don't need, things we don't necessarily want in our lives, things that are possibly useless. And this can have a much bigger, a much more drastic effect on the economy as a whole. Because if we start making irrational decisions on a global scale, on a massive scale, on an economic scale, an entire economy can collapse. In the 2008 Wall Street collapse, where 2.3 million people lost their jobs in the US alone, one of its main reasons was that people took out loans that they did not understand and could not possibly afford. What is even more surprising was that bank managers, bank executives agreed to give people these loans. So in this case, we had an irrational decision made by consumers, normal, natural people, and executives, professionals, trained people. If we better understand irrational decision-making, we will be taking one step closer to solving financial crises, like the one our country is now experiencing. Yes, we do have the power to change our reality, but only if we accept and understand our weaknesses. So, decision irrationality can also have a special impact on young people, on us, youth. But let's face it, we as youth are branded as risk-taking, irrational idiots. At least by my parents, my mom and dad, and at most by all of your parents. So, the problem is, during puberty, during adolescence, a large portion of the decision-making process of the brains of teenagers changes dramatically, leading them to make impulsive, or what our parents call stupid decisions. But reckless decisions, impulsive behavior, shouldn't be stigmatized and seen as a problem by our parents, by our society. It is simply the reflection of a social change, of a biological change that should be nurtured, regulated, and understood by your parents, by your friends, by your teachers, and even by you. Now, I'm not telling you to go out there and do whatever you're thinking of doing after the event, but I believe it is our responsibility to change our society and make them accept our nature. So now we know that every human being on earth, every one of us, can make irrational decisions. And these irrational decisions can lead us to lose money, make poor choices, or have false beliefs. So when we human beings say that we are rational, that we are logical, this is actually a huge mistake. The words rational and human can go along, even in one sentence. Our behavior, our actions, our decisions are far from logical. And that is actually a part of what makes us human. But we can learn from irrational decision-making. We can benefit from it. We can now understand how infinitely small our knowledge in controlling the universe really is by first understanding the irrationality of our actions. If you even want to prevent yourself from making too much irrational decisions, too much reckless decisions in the future, you can follow these 3 simple tips. 1, be with friends who will keep you grounded. Have friends with different ideas, different perspectives, different intellect from you, who will always challenge your ideas. 2, if it sounds good, question it. We always like the idea of winning, of being correct, that we sometimes accept that easy equals true, when in fact it is not. And 3, search for contradictory evidence. If you think something will happen, try researching why it will not. If you think you might get rich in the future, try researching why you might get poor. It may change your perspective. It may prevent you from being biased. So yes, you are irrational, but you can achieve rational irrationality. Thank you.